So this is the intro video for Lab 4 for the Apsc 1299 labs, and we're going to be discussing toggles and menus today. So what you're going to be doing today in part A is you're going to first of all build a soft toggle switch. So in last week's lab, what you had was a button that if you push the button down, the LED turned on, and if you let go of the button, the LED turned off. So what you're building this week is when you push down the button, the LED will turn on and stay on, and when you push the button a second time, that's when the LED turns off. So you've been given some code down here, and as is, this won't work. So you're going to have to add stuff to this to get the code functioning. So to begin with, they create this hasSwitch1changed variable, and they set it to 0. And then they set the pin that is attached to the button to be an input, so it's going to monitor whether the button has been pushed down or not. And then they're going to take this variable, hasSwitch1changed, and they're going to set it equal to the output of this function, monitorSwitch1 for edges. This is located in the buttons.c file, so you should open that up and have a look at how it works. Most of the time, the output of that function is just going to be 0 because there will be no changes to detect in the button's state. However, when the function detects a rising edge, so you just push the button down, it's going to output a 1. That'll be assigned to the variable, and then it executes this piece of code, switch1 rising edge action, another function. That's located down here, and right now it doesn't do anything. If the function monitorSwitch1 for edges detects a falling edge on the button, then it outputs a 2. Again, that gets assigned to our variable, hasSwitch1changed, and that executes another piece of code, another function, switch1 falling edge action, which is located down here on the next page, and again, it doesn't do anything. So you're going to have to add code. Now for a soft toggle switch, what we want is for when you push down the button, it to turn on, and when you push it down a second time, you have it turn off. So this falling edge action, we probably don't need anything in here, but you probably do want something in your rising edge action. So this is where you would put the code to turn the LED on or off. Now something else I want to warn you about, just so you know that it exists, is something called button bounce errors. So here is an example of a button bounce error. This is a very short time scale, so this is all happening within about 100 microseconds. Is the button bounced on and off very quickly. So think about how this would affect your code. The code would interpret this to be 2 button pushes. So you push down the button once as far as you're concerned, but as far as your code is concerned, it's actually been pushed down twice. So it would turn the LED on, for example, and then immediately turn it off, and that would happen on such short time scales that you couldn't actually register it with your eye. So most of the buttons don't do this, but you may find that yours does, and the way in which you'd notice that is that when you push the button down, it's hit or miss whether it actually affects your circuit. So if you're having trouble with this, what I recommend you do is just insert a very short pause of about 100 microseconds into your code. So when your code detects a rising edge, just have it pause for about 100 microseconds before it tries to detect what's going on with the circuit again. And that should get rid of most of your button bounce. Now the last thing you do in part A is that you're going to be modifying things not just to have the LED latch on and off, but also to display something on your LCD. And then they have you modify things so you could have a second switch. So you're going to basically double all the code. When they say here you need to duplicate the existing functions and change 1 to 2, that just means that you would have, for example, a switch 2 falling edge action function and a switch 2 rising edge action, and so on. So you do that, and then part B is quite simple. You're basically going to then double up the physical setup, so the circuit. So you will have 2 buttons with buffer resistors and 2 LEDs with buffer resistors, and when you push one button, one of the LEDs latches on. When you push the other button, the other LED latches on, and they turn off as well. They have down here something they call a grief saver. So what the grief saver is encouraging you to do is to save incremental versions of your code. It's very human when you're coding that if something's not working, you just keep overwriting what you had with some new attempt. But the problem with that is if you get something kind of sort of working, and then your next iteration of the code screws it up, you can't go back to the previous version unless you saved that. So as you're going along, it's a good idea to save your code and then go save as and give it some other name so that you can keep track of the older versions of the code. So you'd have file name underscore 01, 02, and so forth. So this is useful in case you realize later that you have to revert to a previous version of the code. Another thing you might look into
is a program called Git. Git allows you to very quickly take snapshots of your code so that you can in future roll back to previous versions of the code very easily. So using Git is the equivalent of doing save as to save iterations of your code, but it's a lot faster. Professional coders all use Git or something like it to control versions of their code these days, so this is something you will probably want to learn at some point in your career. Whether or not you learn to use it now is up to you, however. I have made some videos on the course website about how to get started using Git if you wish to do so. They'll take about an hour of your time. The videos will also get you started using GitHub, which is an online repository of code that is used in conjunction with Git. What GitHub is particularly useful for is when you're working as part of a team, which you will be doing for the final project of this course. So that's an extra incentive to maybe learn Git now, is you'll be ready to use GitHub with your partners when you do the final project.
So in Part C, you're going to change things up a little bit. Instead of having the button push turn the LED on, your LEDs are going to be blinking constantly. And what the button push does is it'll either make the blink rate faster or slower. So, first of all, they're going to specify what your blink rates should be. So you'll have 4 different speeds, and the manual tells you what blink rate you should have. And in order to do so, you need an understanding of what's called the duty cycle. So I've got a little diagram of this, although you've probably seen this in class. So the duty cycle is the ratio of how long the signal was high, 5 volts for, compared to the period of the entire cycle. So you've got some up and down cycle here, and it's going between 5 volts and ground. And the duty cycle would be the ratio of how long it's on for compared to the entire up and down cycle. So in this case, the period, which is the time for one complete up and down oscillation, is 2 blocks wide, and it's on for 1 block. So it's on half the time and off half the time. So the duty cycle would just be 1 divided by 2, which is usually expressed as a percentage, so 50%. And down here, the period now is 3 blocks long, so it's only on for 1/3 of the time and it's off for 2/3 of the time. So the on cycle is 1 block, the period of the entire up and down oscillation is 3 blocks, so 1 divided by 3 gives you a duty cycle of 33%. Now going back to the code here, again, you've been given a little snippet of code to give you an idea of how to structure things, but you're going to have to add stuff to this. So first of all, they define something called blink rate, and that's going to control how fast your LEDs are blinking. And everything else looks pretty similar to what you saw in Part A. You've got this has switch 1 changed, and you've got this monitor switch 1 for edges function. So you're going to adjust things, and in this case, it'll be if has switch 1 changed has been assigned a value of 1, then the blink rate is going to increase, and when you get to the maximum blink rate, it goes back down to 0. And the actual blinking is controlled by this case switch here. So it's controlled by blink rate, and you'll have to program it here such that things blink at the rates that the manual specifies. So the only thing tricky here is that you're going to have one button that cycles the blink rate faster, and the other button which cycles it slower. Oh, and one other thing about Part C is you will also have your LCD displaying off, slow, moderate, or on for the blink rate. So again, it's very similar to what you did in Part A. This should all be fairly straightforward. So in Part D, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be adding one more bit of functionality to your code. And that is that when you push both buttons at the same time, the LEDs go from blinking together at the same rate to blinking alternately, so one on, one off. So they'll be blinking together to begin with. You push the buttons simultaneously, and your LEDs go from blinking at the same time to blinking one off and one on. So they're asynchronous. And when you push the 2 buttons again, it switches back to blinking synchronously. And your LCD will also display something. And the only tricky bit about this Part D is that it's very easy when you have the LEDs going from synchronously blinking to alternately blinking to accidentally flip the duty cycle of one of them. So you'll have to be a little bit careful about that, but otherwise, based on the stuff you've done earlier, it should be fairly straightforward to do Part D also.